I'm keeping everything else around it. I'm keeping the cuts, I'm keeping the camera pans and whips and all of the little things that could be magic and added to the cut to like really elevate a moment.
What bothers you about certain editing styles?
I think when the style of an edit, and I like stylized editing, like there's moments where I get very stylistic, but I think when the style gets in way of the narrative, when the style kind of becomes front and center to what the film is about or to the story, that's when I start to kind of bump up against styles. And that can be anything from like tropes, editorial tropes, or like too boisterous or inappropriately boisterous moments in an edit. And I like boisterous editing, like I'll definitely get into that. But it needs to be in service of tone, pace, narrative. It needs to be in service of the film, not the other way around. And so for me, like when those things start to detract from the overall goal and motivation of a film, that's where I start to have a problem with it.
How can an editor tell that they're beholden to their workflow?
So you need to set up a strong workflow to cut kind of anything, but definitely long form. You have to have a strong, solid workflow. But when you start from an editorial perspective, when you start working very hard to maintain a workflow or maintain a structure of work, and you're almost working for the workflow, that's when it starts to detract. And so for me, as I'm cutting, there's always an ebb and a flow to the structure in my workflow. Like once I'm starting too hard to maintain a certain workflow, I'll just bail and look for something else. A good example is like note cards. Like I'll put scenes down on note cards and like put them up on my big board, and then I'll be able to start to restructure them and stuff like that. But at some point, I'm just editing for a day or two, and then I'll be like, oh, my note cards are all mixed up. Let me fix them. I'm like, why? I've abandoned the note card system. Like now I'm in the timeline. Like I am free to move on from that workflow. Like I don't need it anymore. I don't feel like I need it to move me forward. And so I'm gonna put that one aside and I'm gonna continue on this way. And so for me, those structures and workflows need to ebb and flow with the process that you're in. And if I'm like cutting a scene and then at the end of the day, I'm like, well, I guess I gotta update my board. It's like, that's not really what the board was for. Like, I feel like we're on a good path with just the timeline. Let's continue down that path. And so you set up the structures, set up the workflow, set up the guardrails, the walls to your sandbox, whatever you wanna call it, set those up, but then be willing to break it down and to ebb and flow with the workflow as the process kind of unfolds.
So then set up the initial sort of way to do it, but then don't be spending so much time working on those ways that it gets involved in editing the movie.
Yeah, like the workflow and the structures should work for you, not the other way around. And so set it up, but modify it as you go.
What takes more skill, audio transition or video transition?
My initial response is audio, because I think you can sell a transition with the speakers way more than you can visually. You can make a clunky edit feel smooth with the right sound, with the right moment, with the right sound effect, with the right volume. Like you can smooth a lot out. And for me, sound is so much more inspiring and interesting to work with, but then also to experience as a viewer. Bresson says, give to the ear what's the ear and the eye, but don't give to the eye what's for the ear. So, and like the speakers are much more interesting. You can do much more work in the speakers to communicate a thought or an idea than you're pretty limited with the screen and with the shot. I mean, horror, this is all horror is, right? It's like you're so much more scared by what you hear than what you see. Once you see it, you're done, you're good. But the sound is what gives you that feeling. And so for me, the audio transition makes the visual transition. And so I need that audio to like inspire, or the lack of audio to inspire. Like just working with the speakers is so much more interesting and then a lot of times creative than working with the screen. And so I would say, based on the importance, in my opinion, of audio in a transition, I would say audio it takes more skill and finesse to really inspire the audience to like be hooked by a transition, which is what you want. You're transitioning to something else. I want to know what happens next. I'm not going to turn this off. And so that's kind of my opinion is that, I mean, the audio kind of makes the transition.
You bring a documentary approach to your narrative editing? How so?
I think it's the willing, it's in a lot of ways it's the posture, being open and willing to let the material tell you what it wants to be. And so for me it's that documentary posture, but then it's also that passion for letting the film tell you what it wants to be and not being restricted by just beautiful images but necessary images. And so for me, when I'm making selects of scenes and I'm trimming stuff, I never want it all to be culled down and things to be chopped out. And I don't really want a selects reel because I don't know what a select is. For me, there's no, I mean, and I say this a lot to my editors, but there's no such thing as a good image or a bad image, just an appropriate image. Like, is this appropriate for the moment? And so when I'm selecting performances, I'm keeping everything else around it. I'm keeping the cuts, I'm keeping the camera pans and whips and all of the little things that could be magic and added to the cut to like really elevate a moment. Like I want to keep all that stuff around, like out of sight, out of mind. I'm never going to go back and look at it. But if it's on the timeline and I can experience it and I can see it. And so I think it's that kind of posture and approach to the material that I consider to be a more documentary approach, even to scripted stuff.
What are your thoughts on a filmmaker who relies on stock footage?
Because you said filmmaker, I'll go down the path of like a filmmaker, because there's a lot of commercial work that utilizes stock footage out of necessity or out of budget restriction, whatever. So that aside, from a stock footage standpoint, I understand getting painted into a corner or needing, like drone shots are easy ones to plug in because they're kind of non-specific, right? And so, but the more specific you need a shot to be, the harder it is, and the more you're kind of going out on the plank to make a stock shot work for a very specific moment. Sometimes you can get lucky, but I wouldn't rely on luck. And so, but that's stock. Then there's archival, which can bring a story to life, especially if it's an archival story, it's an archival moment, whatever. Like you can use relatively generic archival in a very unique and specific way. But this relying too heavily or relying on stock, to me, should be like a last resort. Like we should look for any way possible to kind of avoid that. Obviously, there are some moments where it just has to happen, or we got super lucky and it works super well. But I wouldn't, like, relying on luck is a scary place to be as a filmmaker or an editor.